welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Fry, and I have with me today
Alex Carrick, chief economist for now on a very temporary basis till the end of June, of ConstructConnect, chief economist of ConstructConnect.
That's right. After a very illustrious career, Alex is retiring at the end of June, like he said. So I thought we'd go over that career and what he thinks kind of what the significant construction economy moments were.
Yeah, I'd be pleased to, Warren. Yeah. It's kind of funny because, I don't like to just talk about myself. There are people who would maybe say that that's.
Well, I'm not going to say anything one way or the other. I'm just here to listen.
Yeah, but when I think, because I've been doing this for over 50 years now, and it was 13 years with the Canadian Institute of Steel Construction, and then moving over to Southam, which eventually, after a number of changes over the years, is now ConstructConnect. And the way I think of it, or the way I sort of put it in order in my own mind, is to think of it in terms of decades, because there were certain things that characterized each decade that were sort of the highlights. Like the 70s was really about the emergence of OPEC and the big increase in the price of oil. And that led into the 80s, which was then all about inflation, which was pretty much launched by the something like 13-fold increase in the world price of oil. And we think now that inflation's bad, but in the 1980s, inflation was much worse and interest rates just took off. And I had bought a house or a condo, at least in the mid-1970s, and I was very much concerned about whether I'd be able to even keep, meeting mortgage payments. And then the 90s came along, and inflation started to be beaten back. And the 90s, for the most part, were about the emergence of the high-tech firms. And that was exciting times. And that kind of culminated, though, in the dot-com bust in the early 2000s.
Which, given later events, seems like not that as big a deal, but it was a huge deal at the time.
Yeah, it was really big. And then later in the zeros, we had the world financial crisis and subprime mortgage situation. But also what happened in the zeros was Chinese growth. Chinese growth was in the double digits, and they were buying commodities. And that was a huge boost for the Canadian economy. And the other thing that happened in Canada, or the really big thing, was the emergence of the oil sands. Because if you remember, there was all kinds of workers were moving from the Atlantic to Alberta to help build so many of those projects. So that was a huge thing. And then the financial crisis, as they say, in 08, 09. And that took a long time to recover from that. And part of that story in the 2010s, was the Greek sovereign debt problem that dragged on for years. And then we finally came out of that. And in the 2020s, COVID, coronavirus, came out of nowhere and suddenly caught us all. And we're still, to an extent, dealing with the after effects of that through various government stimulus programs and that sort of thing. So that's kind of how I think of it. Anyway, I'll stop there, because I don't know how much of this you want to do as questions versus just me gabbing away here.
Oh, no, gab away, please. But one thing I was thinking of when you're talking about is just sort of the difference, because as an economist, you know more about cycles than most people do. So there's a lot of cycles being mentioned here, but there's also stuff that just kind of came out of nowhere, like you said, like COVID. I mean, I guess if you go far enough back, Spanish flu, it's not out of nowhere, but things that just really make the economy go on a right turn out of nowhere. But there's also stuff that you can see coming because it's happened before.
Yeah, well, there's cycles, and there are they've been given the term white swan events. Mm-hmm. And somebody was saying to me one day about a bird flu, and and I said, yeah, well, the bird flu crisis, that's about as pure a white swan event as you can have, ornithologically speaking. I
yes,
thought that
true.
was, I thought
but
that was kind of witty, ornithologically speaking.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but one of the lessons from all of this is that there's resilience. Each one of these that you go into, you think that it's, you know, maybe the worst thing that's ever happened or the worst thing that can ever happen. But no, we get through it. We do get through it. The weirdest one by far, I've got to say, is coronavirus, though, because that's not cyclical. That just happened, and that was the sort of thing that you see in movies and so on that you never thought would strike. But
right.
My goodness, between 1 month and the next month, a huge chunk of the labor force was out of work, and that was really a big deal. And of course, when I'm asked to look back, I do look back on the people, and everybody says this when they retire, that it's the people they met and the bonds that they form and so on that were the most important. That is true. There's no question that that's true. And I would just throw out there that the people I met earlier in my career, looking back, I think there were more characters around there than
Well,
there
that's
are now.
journalism that applies to as well, too.
Yeah, well, it applies to almost everything. And there still are characters around now, but man, there were some real characters when I was starting up. And some those rough edges got polished off over the years. But what I was going to say about technological, there's all kinds of aspects of that. One of the really great things about my job has been that it has forced me to keep up with technology. And I have a story that I tell people about. Well, first of all, when I joined Southam, when I moved from the Steel Institute to Southam, which is a big Canadian publications firm at the time.
Right, yeah.
So there were all kinds of people in the building. But I was the very first person in the building to be given a desktop computer.
Oh, okay, wow. What kind? Because I'm a nerd, I want to know what kind of computer it was.
I don't know. I couldn't tell you. And I don't think it was a Dell, because I don't think Dell had come along.
Might have been
to
an IBM
that
PC.
point.
Yeah.
It was probably Hewlett Packard or yeah. And I remember that I had to learn. It was Lotus at the time rather than Excel.
Yes. Yeah.
So I sat on the beach in the summer because I was hired in May of 1985. And I sat on the beach that summer reading a Cole's Notes crib version of how to do spreadsheets.
Of 1, 2, 3.
Spreadsheets. Yeah. And I mean, this was even before there was the Office suite. And that's how I learned it. And then that Office suite, that was huge. That made a huge difference because word processing programs before then were really just not very
WordStar. I had to use that in school. It sucked. It was terrible.
Yeah. And to do graphs, I had to use something called Harvard Graphics. And that was this crazy machine with an arm on it. And the arm would grab a pen, and the pen would go up and down and create the graph. And that just really wasn't viable. That was.
I'm getting flashbacks to Byte magazine from the early 80s here with all this stuff because I'm ringing some bells.
Yeah. So they did come up with PowerPoint. And one of the stories I love to tell about PowerPoint is that I spent time really learning it. And when you first got it, it was wonderful. And it still is wonderful. But I remember that I came across one of these commands called slide transitions.
Oh, dear. I know where this is going.
Yeah. And so I had to make a presentation, an Outlook presentation to staff members in a hotel in the suburbs of Toronto. And I thought, well, I'm going to throw this in here. And I think I was one of the first people who really did this. I mean, I'm sure there were people elsewhere, but and I know that I was one of the first because we had the Canada conference and we had all the speakers at the Canada conference, and I know what they were doing. I did this presentation and I used transition on on three slides out of about 20. And so I had the first couple of slides were normal, and then about slide 4 or 5, I suddenly did this thing where half the slide would come in from the left of the screen and half the slide would come in from the right.
Yeah.
And everybody in the audience went nuts. I mean, they just went nuts. They had never seen this, and they were going, ooh, and ah, and I can't believe it. Just exactly what I was hoping for. Then a few slides later, I did it again, and the slide came in and it's whirling around on the screen. And this time, a few oohs and ahs. And then towards the end, I did it for the third time.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what the transition was, but it was something pretty fancy. And hardly any reaction at all.
Yeah.
And that taught me a valuable lesson. And that is that audiences are really fickle.
Okay, well, I can tell you, having worked in TV in the 90s, we were told, and this is very strict, you didn't use any, there's a million transitions in Avid or whatever we were using, but you could only use dissolve and fade to black, and that was it, because anything else would drive people crazy. So that's why these things were a surprise, because you never saw them on TV, because you weren't allowed to use them on TV. It was just a sort of a rule of thumb, like only these two, and even then. so that's why. So because, like you said, people get sick of it real quick.
Yeah. Well, like audiences, well, what have you done for me lately? You know, like 5 minutes later.
Exactly. Yeah. 5 minutes later. And that's in the 80s when it's, new. So.
Yeah. So that's one of the really funny ones, I think. But no, the technology over the years has played a huge role in everything. And when I think back about the coronavirus and the pandemic, I just think that's the most amazing thing that happened at exactly the same time as Zoom and GoTo and Teams and so on were coming up with their way to have virtual meetings. I mean,
we're doing that right now.
Yeah. You talked about the Spanish flu. Well, they didn't have that. I mean, what would we have done with all of us working at home if we didn't suddenly have this technology that was so adaptable so quickly?
Yeah, the economy would have been much worse hit. I mean, it was still already pretty badly hit, but we were still able to shift somewhat seamlessly depending on the industry.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I remember the first weekend we were sent home because we were told in March that the office was going to close. My family and I went up to our cottage. We've actually got 2 places up north, and one of them's sort of my office. And I sat there on a Saturday afternoon, and I thought, well, I'm going to have to learn this stuff. And I downloaded GoToMeetings, I think it was, and I started trying to connect with my wife in the other cottage, who thought I was out of my mind. And, and I said, no, we're going to have to know this. And by the end of the weekend, we were doing it. Now, people were doing this. I know that people were doing this when they were going on trips and so on before, but it wasn't common practice. But that became just hugely important to us very quickly. And over the next 3 years, I figured that I did at least 2 virtual presentations every month. So I did about 70 presentations over those 3 years. That's what I've got to figure. And they were all virtual. And then we got back to actually going live out to people. But the technology has been a huge part, and it's been a big part of what every company does and so on. And there's been other things that have really changed too. And if you think about technology, it's changed even the types of structures that are built.
That's what I was going to ask next. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's two things. One is green. Like I think it was about in the 80s where everybody suddenly started to become conscious of green. I can tell you that when I started back in 1973, I guess, 72 or 73, no, there wasn't a lot of talk about the environment and worrying about green and so on. So it was in the 80s where that really started to take over, and the technological advances started to take over as well. Nowadays, everybody has claims that they're green. You go to any website of any company, and they say that they're green. And of course, the internet and websites, everybody having websites, that's all part of it as well. But green and the types of buildings that are built, because it's data centers, like that's just huge. The whole office building category of construction, where any kind of support is coming for that? Because, we have moved to this hybrid model of working. Where that's coming from is data centers. There are these huge data centers that are being built all over the place. And another type of structure that I would say, or at least another part of the economy as a whole, that is much bigger than it used to be, is the entertainment sector. I just can't say enough about how much that has changed. When I grew up, nobody was in entertainment where I grew up. And I grew up in London, Ontario, which is about 120 miles outside of Toronto. And your career options were quite limited. You either figured out that you'd end up being a teacher, or you'd be in insurance, or you'd be a reverend, a minister.
Another kind of insurance.
I mean, it sounds crazy now, but that was it. Whereas the kids growing up now, and we live in Toronto, but entertainment's everywhere. We have our neighbor's son has moved to Vancouver, and he worked on the movie Dune. Like he's into the graphics, CGI.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of VFX companies here. That's right. Yeah.
Yes. And in Toronto and Montreal, and of course all over the United States, Atlanta, Nashville, California, New York. There are all these opportunities.
And that's more decentralization, because it used to be all in Hollywood or even all in Toronto. Now it can be anywhere.
Yeah. Well, he's in Vancouver, and he comes and he visits his parents who live next to us. And the last time he came, he told us the story about how he had worked on CGI for the movie Dune. And sure enough, his name is in the credits. And he said for 4 months, all he did was look at his monitor that was filled with sand.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, he had to move the sand around for the worms in Dune. Well, how phenomenal is that? I mean, that's just great. Our own son, one of our two sons, graduated in music. And I don't know where he got the music skill from, because it's certainly not me. But he wrote the music for a movie that appeared at the Toronto International Film Festival. And a lot of his friends are artistic like that. So that's the type of construction as sound stages and so on. I give Netflix a lot of credit, because Netflix opened up everybody's eyes to the possibilities of movies and shows from all around the world.
Which is indicative of the greater economy, right? So globalization.
Like rising tide lifts all boats, and that is the way it goes. Yeah.
So just in terms of the future, because you always have one eye on the future. What do you see for construction in the future in terms of the economy and where we're headed with the given? You've already cited entertainment, but geopolitical stuff you've cited before, which is kind of tough to predict. But given things that happened in the last couple of years, very tough to predict. But where do you see all this headed? And given your vast years of experience at this?
Well, the big thing is the big trend, and it's one of the biggest trends ever, is this attempt by countries, governments around the world for energy transition off of fossil fuels, which we've been dependent on for 200 years at least, to move towards renewables. And it's looking like it's going to be a very difficult goal to achieve for a whole bunch of reasons. There's backlash right now against electric vehicles because of range issues and cold weather issues and a whole bunch of things like that. And also it's the materials that go into these cars and being able to access them and having approvals for projects. In terms of how things have changed over the years, it's much harder to get approvals for anything. Much harder to get approvals for mines and pipelines and so on than it used to be. And that's got to be overcome, or we're just not going to achieve these other goals that we want to achieve. I'm very optimistic. I don't see how the construction industry can be anything but a real booming sector. But there's going to be a lot of things that are going to have to be overcome, and labor shortages is another one,
and housing, the whole housing.
Well, housing, yes,
yeah,
and Canadian population is just increasing like absolute mad. Returning to technology, if I can, one of the really big things, of course, that we did do with Southam and then the various sequel companies was the Canada Conference. We put that on for 35 years, and we met wonderful people doing that, including some of the most incredible speakers too. Meeting some of those speakers was a real thrill. We had some of our regulars. We had people like Ray Wong and Peter Norman that we had back year after year, and Peter Hall from Export Development Corporation. But then, of course, as keynote speakers, we had Justin Trudeau and Bob Ray.
Before he was Prime Minister, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, and Carl, my personal favorite, or the one that gave me the biggest thrill, was Carl Bernstein.
Absolutely, yeah. Same here. I mean, I was there for that one. Yeah. Great.
Having him up was really, really a thrill. But again, the technology, we hit the 2020s and coronavirus arrived, and we did do the Canada Conference for a couple of years virtually, and it was pretty successful. But times change and things, priorities of companies change and so on. So we haven't done it the last couple of years. But the Canada Conference was a huge part of all these times, and meeting all the people from the construction industry who came to those. As for the construction industry itself and the changes there's new categories of owners than there used to be too. Like there's private equity firms and hedge funds and public private partnerships and so on. And the industry is far more into cooperative efforts and so on. It helps a company if they have several people on staff who speak several languages, because there's often an international component to construction, and that's one of the big changes as well. So there's just it's quite a different world than it used to be. That's for sure.
So just finally, what do you personally, you and your wife, what are you planning to do? I would assume you're going to do some traveling, because you already have done quite a bit of traveling in your life. So is that going to continue once you're retired?
I don't know that we will. Now, there's another thing. People love to travel. And certainly that's just a huge growth industry, and particularly with the aging population, because so many people have bucket lists that they want to realize, including myself, because you reach my age and you lose a lot of the people who are relatives or friends. And that inspired Donna and I, my wife Donna, and I to go to Egypt, for example.
I've been there. It's pretty
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't have missed it for anything. I mean, really, it's one of the highlights of our lives. And then we took our kids to Paris and had a week in Paris, and that was wonderful. As for whether we'll do a lot more traveling, I think we might. I think a trip to South America might be in the cards. I'm looking forward to that. The thing with I won't pretend otherwise, though. One of the things about travel is you reach a certain age, and it's harder on you. It's harder on your
definitely
harder on your body. Like
in my 50s, and I even feel that now.
Yeah, like some of the foods,
Fair enough. Egypt kind of did a number on me. I get where you're coming from.
Yeah, and it's expensive. My goodness, it's expensive. You could buy a car for what you can spend on taking your family to Europe, sort of thing. But I do like travel. I don't think I've ever regretted any particular trip, because you learn something from it. No, Donna and I have we actually have a sideline company. Donna works full time at another job, accounts receivable for a firm, and I've had my full time job. But again, in terms of technology, in the early 2000s, we recognized that you could publish, like you can do digital publishing, and we started up a company called Carrick Publishing, which has been really, really a lot of fun for us. It's not like it's been a huge money maker or anything like that.
No, but
we've published. I think Donna says that we've published something like 200 books for various people and so on. And it's all digital.
You're ahead of the curve then, yeah.
You can order the hard copy, and one of the most fun things is a book launch. So of those 200 books, we've probably had about 12 book launches at a Prime store in Toronto, and I don't think the Marion, who owns the store, would mind mentioning the name. It's Sleuth of Baker Street.
Oh, okay.
On Millwood in Toronto, and we've had these book launches, and that's about as much fun as you can have, because the ones where we've done the book launches have been anthologies. So you get all the authors, like 15 to 20 authors for the anthology, and they ask all their friends and their relatives to come to the book launch, and you got all these people jammed into the room, and then the authors read an excerpt from their story, and it's great. It's great. And there's been awards for some of these stories. And actually, there was a CBC documentary on the group, Mesdames of Mayhem. So we're certainly going to continue with that. But we also have property that needs caring for. A farm. We've got a former Christmas tree farm.
Oh, wow.
That has 13,000 Christmas trees that have grown too big to be sold as Christmas trees. It's just for walking around in, basically. And I'll spend time caring for that property, because you can bring in forest management that will take away some of the wood as lumber and so on. So I expect to keep quite busy.
Yeah. Well, okay. I would say that I'm not alone in this, and wishing you all the best in your future endeavors. And we're all very grateful for everything you've done for ConstructConnect for the past, like you said, 30, 40 odd years.
Yeah, Warren. Well, thank you. And it's been a joy working with you and everybody else. I really have said I've had 100% job satisfaction. I really, really have had, because it's kept me up to date on everything that's going on in the world and so on. And I've loved doing that. I've loved making the connections between something that happens way over here and what the impact is on the economy and on construction specifically. It's been a wonderful job. I'm just so grateful and so thankful for it.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Alex.
Okay. And thank you, Mark.
Thanks for listening to the Construction Record Podcast. You can hear us on Apple Music, Amazon, and Spotify, as well as at theconstructionrecord.libsyn.com and on the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce websites. Thanks again for listening.